And I also want to extend a thank you to the law firm of Dykema and Sherry Farrell, who chairs the diversity and inclusion initiatives at the law firm. They stepped up and generously offered to sponsor our Black History Month programming this year, so we thank them for that. This is, round of applause. Thank you. This is the second year that we've done a series of teach-ins as part of our Black History Month programming, and what we're discovering is that these teach-ins are a very valuable and important part of the programming because they give us a chance as a community to look at and think about the many intersections between Black history and Black life and the law. We don't always get a chance to pay attention to those intersections in a classic law school curriculum, so we hope that this afternoon gives you a chance to focus on some of those issues and ask questions about things that interest you. Today, I'm very happy to say that we have one of our stellar own here at the podium, and that would not be me, but Professor Adele Morrison. Professor Morrison publishes in the areas of family law, critical race theory, and LGBT issues. And today, she's going to talk with us about some of the socioeconomic issues that are having a particular impact in the Black community. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Morrison.
Stellar, I like that. Switch from coffee to water. All right, thank you, and good afternoon, all. Thank you. All right, and thanks to Savala for inviting me and putting up with my tantrums. I was like, what do you mean it's going to be videotaped? My hair isn't very good for videotape. I don't even know where for videotape. So thank you, and to those of you who are watching it on video, I hope my hair looks okay and the double chin is not showing up. And also thanks to Dykema very much for being for providing the ability to have these great a series of events. It's been wonderful to be able to look up and look at all the things that are going on, even to the extent where they're competing with each other. That's wonderful, and that we get exposed to aspects of Black history, Black culture, Black lives this month. So thank you to the folks at Dykema. So since this is teaching, not a lecture, and some of my students are here, going to be like, I might just call on you. I expect you all to be engaged during this time. I'll ask some questions and see if you can answer them. Though I'll save the more substantive Q&A for the end. Since I'm sure I'm going to be introducing some ideas, and I'm actually going to put my clock out because the clock's in the wrong spot here. Introducing some new ideas. If you have any questions or something you don't understand, just please go ahead and let me know. Go ahead and raise your hand, and I can fill in if you want some interaction. And I would take some time to explain some of the issues when we start out, some of the connections. So this afternoon, basically, I want to get to a place where we can begin to at least explore and hopefully understand the interconnectedness of subordinated communities. Specifically Black and LGBT, by locating at the center of our discussion those whose intersecting identities are Black and LGBT. Interconnected subordination and intersecting identities can be complicated ideas, especially when the critical race, Lat crit, and queer crit theory types get a hold of them. But at its core, and I mean to shorthand it, is that I want to talk about the black and gay history and the present by talking about Black gays, gay Blacks, and LGBT allies. And I include allies because there has and continues to be a perception that Black LGBT persons and how those two major political and social legals impact them, that there are no allies within them, that there are split groups and there are no allies. Now, the most recent title, I've been monkeying around with this for a long time, of this discussion is socio-legal issues in the Black LGBT communities. And that's just a way of saying that we'll talk about two issues that are political, social, and legal. Also, you will note I use communities because there is no singular or essential black LGBT or black LGBT communities. But there are at least U.S. essentializations of black LGBT and black LGBT communities, meaning there are perceptions about blacks because they are black, and the same being true for lesbians, gay men, bisexual, and transgender people. Now, there are some maybe wondering why I'm using black and not African American. First, of course, it's Black History Month, so we want to stay with the theme. But also, I want to acknowledge, even though I'm going to be talking primarily about issues in the U.S., that there are black people who are not African Americans. As I like to say, some of my best friends are African Canadians, but they refer to themselves as black Canadians. Also, often when speaking, though not so much in writing, I'd either refer to the communities of which I speak as black queer communities, but I'm not doing so here for 3 reasons. One, some people still find queer to be pretty offensive and exclusive, and I don't want to offend, other, or exclude anyone. Also, since this is Black History Month, and I'll be talking about some recent history, queer was definitely a pejorative and not used in those times. In the time periods where I will begin, homosexual, and it was probably the most common term, or homophile, that was not offensive. That could be said. That too could be said of black or African American. And the times I will begin with, we're talking primarily either about using the term Negro or even colored. The Q for queer or questioning, the I for intersex, and the A, asexual or allies, and I speak in generalities here, are not generally included when discussing political, legal, or social issues in quote-unquote mixed company, shall we say. In fact, President Obama was the first president to utter the word transgender in any speech when he did so in the State of the Union address this year. And also the first president to include lesbian and bisexual in the State of the Union address. So today I'll be referring mostly to black LGBT folks and sometimes shorthanded for the heck of it, black gays. Or where specificity is called for, I will be specific. For the presentation that will frame our discussion, I'm going to talk about 2 people, 2 places that will be emblematic of historical events that impact 2 particular contemporary issues important to black and LGBT communities, and especially black LGBT communities. So, 2 people, 2 places, 2 problems. And I choose the word problems because they have created political and social and legal problems for a variety of individuals and those in the community, and because I like the alliteration of people, places, and problems. And we'll talk a little critical race theory, discussing how the people and the places and the problems interact with each other, constructing interconnected subordinations, intersexual identities, and converging interests. This is not a comparison of oppressions, or to say one group has it worse than the other, or as bad as another. I want to simply bring some visibility to that which is often left invisible, and not that in a lot of ways we are actually, and note that in a lot of ways we are actually all in this together. Fundamentally, I want to expose you to the notion that black history and LGBT history are not mutually exclusive histories, and that a given issue, which may be seen as a black problem or a gay problem, is often a black and gay problem. And black LGBT people can get it coming and going. Now, I'm not a former history major or anything like that, so we'll keep the sort of history a little bit more shallow than those who actually study history on the facts, right? So people and places are more representative of a time than anything else. So let's start with the people, and this is where you come in. Has anyone heard of Mildred Loving and Bayard Rustin? First, who is Mildred Loving? Anybody heard of Mildred Loving, Mildred Jeter Loving, and Bayard Rustin? Or just raise your hand if you've heard of them. Either of them. All right. Okay, so who was Mildred Jeter Loving? Is there anybody who's taking my family on? Because you should know. Mildred Jeter Loving. Okay. Those of you who raised your hand, and it seems like we got a couple of professors in the back right now. Who is Mildred Jeter Loving? Professor Lund.
I think she was the party in Loving versus Virginia.
Exactly. She was a party in Loving versus Virginia. What was Loving versus Virginia?
Anti-miscegenation.
What about anti-miscegenation?
It wasn't in the Supreme Court case that ruled that it was a violation of the Constitution to ban interracial marriages.
Absolutely, right? Loving v. Virginia. It was Mildred Loving, her husband, Mildred née Jeter Loving, and her husband, Richard Loving. She's a black woman who, along with her white husband, were the named plaintiffs in Loving v. Virginia, a U.S. Supreme Court case that struck down Virginia's anti-miscegenation law in 1967. Bayard Rustin. Who's Bayard Rustin? Yeah, who's Bayard Rustin?
He was a civil rights activist. He lived with Martin Luther King. Didn't have any recognition back in the 1960s because he was a gay man in a relationship with a gay man who's upstate gay.
Yeah, that's basic. Now, do you know what he's most famous for, though?
I know him for.
Anybody know what he was probably most famous for, or eventually became famous for? Because you're actually right, not getting the recognition. Many consider him to have been the architect, and definitely was the main organizer in the March on Washington for the actual title. Though it's 1963 March on Washington for Jobs, Freedom, and Jobs and Freedom. The march where Martin Luther King Jr. gave the what has since become known as the "I Have a Dream" speech. And exactly, the thing about Bayard Rustin is he was gay. And because of that fact, in the mid-1950s, he was arrested multiple times for homosexual activity. And because of that arrest and the fact that he was not hidden about his homosexuality, he was marginalized within the movement and relegated to behind-the-scenes work. This is a man who worked with Gandhi and was early organizer of the Freedom Rides. He went to jail as many times as others during the Civil Rights March. And he was essentially arrested in the 50s for his identity as a gay man, and in the 60s for his identity as a black man. A place where the intersections of still with policing come into place, right? Okay, places. Where and what is the Stonewall in? Stonewall.
It's a New York City nightclub.
And anything specific about this nightclub?
One night it was raided by the NYPD, and there were riots.
And why was it raided by the NYPD?
It was a gay club.
Basically, right? Stonewall Bar in New York, that was the location. It was what has come to be known as the Stonewall Riots, or for other people, the rebellions. And the rebellion took place at the end of June 1969. Police, as was their habit, raided the bar, which was frequented by folks who were marginalized by many in the homosexual underground, namely drag queens, transvestites, butch dykes, transgender people, hustlers, etc. This particular night, it is argued, that the police lost control of the situation. Now, through, let's just call it some overzealous and inappropriate policing. Even for a time when that simply being in public in the wrong person's clothes or located in the wrong place at the wrong time, this was still rather zealous or overzealous. The police drew a crowd outside the bar, and those present have asserted that the police incited a riot that went on in the Greenwich Village neighborhood for several days. A year later, in commemoration, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Chicago held marches to commemorate that rebellion. Now, we have Pride Month, but that's why it's in June. It's to commemorate, and the last Sunday in June commemorates the Stonewall Rebellion. Okay, what is a blind pig, and what happened at 1 on 12th and Claremont in Detroit? Professor Ackerman.
It is a social establishment, I think, that operates at the margin of the law, and it was where the rebellion of 1967.
Exactly, right? Essentially, social establishment is otherwise known as an unlicensed after-hours club. And in 1967, the Detroit police raided this particular party, which according to, I forget which book, Freedom, there's oral histories was it was a private party at this night that was celebrating the return of some GIs, and what has come to be known as the 1967 Detroit race riot started. 43 people were killed, over 1,000 injured, and over 7,000 arrested. It went on for several days. The National Guard was called in, as was the Army. Now I picked this one because it's local, but this happened, this one happened after the 1964 Harlem riots and the 1965 Watts riots. It, like Stonewall, started at a bar, essentially as a result of a police raid. Some say it was the rebellion, such as B's, that really ushered in the Black Power movement, as contrasted with the Civil Rights movement. You must recall that this happened in 1967, and this was post the Civil Rights Act of 1964, post the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, as a note, we're talking about basically 1960 to 1970, the 60s, when these were going on. The 1963 March on Washington, later that year, JFK was assassinated. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, and Selma to Montgomery March, as the movie Selma portrays. The 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the assassination of Malcolm X. The 1967 Loving decision, and the Detroit riot. 1968, MLK and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated. 1969, the Stonewall Rebellion. And what was going on this entire time? That started earlier and ended later. The 60s. What?
Is it Vietnam?
Vietnam, right? So meanwhile, Vietnam is going on. Went on for nearly 20 years. The Vietnam War. Okay, so we've got the people, we've got the places. Let's turn to the problems. Now, what would you say is, right now, the LGBT-related issue, most in the forefront of society, politics, and especially the law? Marriage, right? Same-sex marriage. Supreme Court is taking it up again. One of the joint cases is from right here in Michigan. We're up to 36 states and I believe 21 tribes that perform and recognize same-sex marriage statewide, and even though there are some of those states that are resistant. Now, what would you say is nationally the political, social, legal issue that most folks would think of at this time when it comes to Black communities and individuals? Yeah.
Police brutality, Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, police brutality, the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Criminal law's reaction to the criminal law and the reaction to the killing of Black men. In Ferguson, Michael Brown, Staten Island, Eric Garner, and many, many others. So, the next question is, where is the connection? How are Mildred Loving in 1967, Bayard Rustin in 1963, Stonewall in 69, and the Blind Pig at 12th and Claremont in 67, and same-sex marriage and police brutality related? Now, talking about, this is the critical race theory aspects of intersecting subordinations, intersectional identities, and interest convergence. Now, intersecting subordination, in this instance, essentially means that racism and heterosexism work together in such a manner that if one is weakened, others would be impacted as well. And the dominant structures, referred to by Professor Frank Valdez and others as Euro-heteropatriarchal elitism, would begin to crumble. The intersectional identities is the idea that individuals and groups often have overlapping identities or traits that are simultaneously working. For example, Kimberly Crenshaw, who developed intersectional theory, has a work that discusses domestic violence and the marginalization of Black women, and the notion that battering works against Black women not in separate identities as Blacks and women, but in her wholeness, and that for there to be responses needs to address the individual in her wholeness and not in part. Interest convergence is a Derek Bell theoretical application. Derek Bell, essentially a godfather of critical race theory, who passed away a few years ago. that states that a majority group will tolerate advances by a minority or subordinated group only when it's in its interest to do so. In this case, we're talking about black heterosexuals and white LGBT folks as the dominant groups. These are the foundational theories grounding the notion that the people, the places, and the problems, and who and what they represent are connected, interdependent, and that knowing about them can advance the cause of subordinated groups everywhere. The notion that there is a black problem and a gay problem, and never the twain shall meet, and that blacks and gays are on opposite sides, as is first belied by the very existence of black LGBT people, and second, by the way history is embedded, whether recognized or not, in addressing marriage equality and police brutality and killings. Mildred Loving, Bayard Rustin, and marriage equality. How are they connected? Loving versus Virginia is a case that has been cited in pretty much every marriage equality related case that has come before any court. It was a key case that established marriage as a fundamental right. In the absence of a Supreme Court case that struck down anti-miscegenation laws across the country, and if I'm remembering correctly, there were 15 or 16 states that still had laws on the books when Loving came down, with the exception of Delaware, mostly southern and southwestern states. Without this decision, the fight for marriage equality would have a whole different look. Also, interestingly enough, the 15, 16 states that still had anti-miscegenation laws on the books at the time were many of the same states that are currently fighting tooth and nail against marriage equality. Also, the connection is that Mildred Loving, who spoke on the 40th anniversary of the Loving v. Virginia case, endorsed marriage equality. I'm going to give you a quote from her talk. She began saying, she wasn't a political person at the time. She says, I'm still not a political person, but I'm proud that Richards in my name is on a court case that can help reinforce the love, the communities, the fairness, and the family that so many people, black or white, young or old, gay or straight, seek in life. I support the freedom to marry for all. That is what loving and loving are all about. In the absence of Bayard Rustin, essentially designing how to do a march on Washington, a very successful march on Washington, they were expecting over 100,000 people. They apparently got over 250,000 people. Subsequent marches, including the one in 1993, 30 years after the Rustin organized march for lesbian, gay, and bi equal rights and liberation, would have no blueprint from which to work. Notice the title of the 1993 march is the 1993 March on Washington for Lesbian, Gay, and Bi Equal Rights and Liberation. Transgender was not included in the title. In 1993, a group was being marginalized in the same way that Bayard Rustin, a gay man, was marginalized in 1963. There are intersecting identities here. Being barred from marrying the one you love and needing to gather together in the nation's capital to be heard. And what do Stonewall in 1969, Detroit in 1967 have to do with police brutality in 2015? Well, it was the police. Overstepping, interacting poorly with the community at a bar or in a club that resulted in deaths, injuries, and arrests. And the same is true today. It is the same people being mistreated at the hands of law enforcement that were on the streets in the 1960s and in the 2010s. Blacks and LGBT folks are greatly over-policed, particularly young black men and trans women of color. Those who were on the streets of Detroit in 1967 and Ferguson, Missouri, and Staten Island in 2014, and who were in the streets of Greenwich Village in 1967, and the streets of New York, LA, San Francisco, and Chicago, and Detroit every day. Prisons are full of blacks, straight and cisgender, gays, and trans. There are converging interests, such as staying alive and staying out of prison. My point is not a complicated one, though of course in my writing I must make it seem like it is. The point is that there are historical and modern connections that bring blacks and gays and Latinos and trans folks and women and cis women and trans women, et cetera, from which we can recognize our identities, that our identities intersect, that our interests do converge, and they can help to unlock and tear down subordination. Any questions? That's the end of that part. Questions, comments, discussion? Yeah.
So it's inspiring to hear about marches, giant marches on Washington and so forth from the quote-unquote civil rights era. But the thing that's been frustrating for me is that we have today, well, in the last, say, 5 to 10 years, more public demonstrations than there have ever been, both in the United States and the world, certainly including the civil rights era, what we think of as the civil rights era. So I was recently at a talk where Mark Fancher basically said, look, they don't work anymore like they used to. We need new tactics. And then the conversation went elsewhere. So as we're talking about intersectionality, and I'm thinking about the Black Lives Matter delegation in Palestine and elsewhere in the intersectionality of those various struggles, the fact that the traditional tactics don't work, I'm asking you what tactics we should be thinking of or trying to think of, or how we should be thinking about tactics.
I mean, there's an interesting, for those of, I don't know if anybody in the other room could hear that question. It was talking about tactics and sort of being in the streets versus, do they work today or don't they work today? There's an interesting question about this. We were actually just talking about these sorts of things in my domestic violence class seminar. And it's like, do they work, don't they work? Now, on an international scale, one might say that, in the streets that do work. Tactics that we might be thinking of today, there are those who would argue that we need to actually return to the tactics where they have to be, there's a uniformity. And part of the problem is that, there's a sort of lack of direction, right? You heard about it with the Occupy movement. It's like there's one people over here who are talking about one thing, another person over here is talking about another thing, right? And bringing people together with one direction. There was seriously a movement, right, that built to the Civil Rights Act. Now, the question is going to be whether anyone actually believes that federal government, and acts can actually do any good, and particularly the fact that, we're refighting the Voting Rights Act, right? So, you can watch me avoid your question to say what tactics are going to work. I don't know, except that if there's a uniform, and it's been argued by the likes of Beth Ritchie, who's an anti-violence against women, and particularly she works with women of color in prison. And the prison abolitionists have really sort of moved away from sort of talking about the law as a tactic for poor people and people of color and other subordinated groups. And then actually sort of having the type of vision for, jobs and peace, right? Those sorts that actually are sort of striving for one thing. The fact being that, at least in the U.S., right, to make transitions, there's a legal connection. So some sort of, right, re-marching about voting rights are. You can look and see the reactions of sort of what has worked. For example, around net neutrality, right? Millions of calls and emails and people being upset about it, and the FAA, no, that was drones. FCC comes out, with something that the people more wanted. So, a cohesive anti-subordination movement, of which there was that, right, more. I mean, for example, the international movement to free Angela Davis, right, was one thing we wanted to get done, right, and as opposed to somebody wants this, someone, and then, and there's also, it's an interesting thing, I think one of what might actually motivate people more is, and we were talking about this in class again, is that police tactics have been different. And granted, it's the militarization, tanks, right? but have stopped, in 1967, the 43 people who were killed were mostly killed by either sniper fire or were shot by National Guard or law enforcement. You take so live round ammunition. No one, right, in any of the protests in Ferguson died, right, from live round ammunition. Now I'm sure there were deaths from other things that we didn't hear about. And so that the police tactics and actually moving back sort of behind the militarization have actually changed some of the movement because there's a generation that doesn't feel threatened. And it was interesting because it's like, I don't know, I was talking to students who are learning me about a level of this sort of social media activism that most end up doing what we used to call checkbook charity in the same kind of way, right? You can now pay $5 by just to help the people in Haiti by pressing a button. So many have been calling sort of, we need a level of motivation to that is toward one thing or one giant thing. The other thing that is not present. I mean, there's a different in social movement theory, right? The presence for certain events or certain ongoing activities. And the other thing that's missing is no one's being drafted to go to Vietnam.
Word.
And regular poor working class, middle class folks are not being drafted to go to Vietnam. And some have argued that helped motivate, right? A lot of people are getting together, particularly, people of color, right? Poor folks were on the front lines because you could get waivers if you have college degrees. And so that there is no great mobilizing, right? That there's a sort of a looking inward through one or more screens on a day, and that a level of single issue. And I think it was actually Tip O'Neill who said, beware of the single issue voter. That said, beware of the single issue activist, the inability to see, which has been a complaint that I've had about sort of the LGBT community with all its focus on marriage. It's like, there's a bunch of other stuff that is mattering about people's lives. And you've poured a lot, congratulations, HRC, et cetera, poured a lot of money. But there was a point that they'd gotten to where anyone who wanted to bring up anything else on national meetings was basically kicked out of meetings. So it's like, there's a single issue, and look what happens in a single issue, right? So having a single issue and something mobilization, something to mobilize people and get them actually, I'm thinking that if they're gonna come draft someone, you might be a little more willing to do something else about it. Does that answer your question? Just my thoughts on it.
Yeah.
In other words, I don't really know.
But it puts stuff in my head, so.
Yeah. It's interesting because you sort of talk about like the LGBT, and also the ability to use the streets, the people in the streets, to actually get change done sort of in the inside. We talked about AIDS activism, and a lot of people were like really annoyed with ACT UP, but it was because of ACT UP that they ever got, that Fauci ever listened to anybody. Because it was like, if you don't listen to the doctors or whoever and getting drugs into bodies, we're going to sick those people on you, kind of issue, which is very interesting. Because the ability to sort of use the streets if there's a focus, if there's a particular focused issue that needs to be addressed, which, and there's a lot of other things as well.
One thing you said that I wasn't quite sure if I agreed with, or maybe I don't understand fully, but was that a lot of the states that oppose black and white marriage are the same states lining up now to oppose gay marriage. And then to some extent, obviously that's true, but there's also states like Michigan and California that have had anti-gay initiatives, and I'm just wondering your thoughts on what is behind those supposed blue states that are still involved in that type of effort.
Yeah, it was yeah, they're still involved. They're absolutely still involved in that type of effort. One of the things I think makes it differently. It was one of the things that, let me go back. what struck me as I was working on the talk is that there's a couple of maps that talked about the states that were, the 15, 16 states that still had the anti-miscegenation law when Loving came down, and you can do a similar overlay of the map that are most resistant to at this point, right? So like Alabama's like, we don't have to listen to a federal judge. And then it kind of basically said that back then too, we're not listening to a federal judge, right? So that was that. But the response to the blue states, one of the difference, and particularly you say California, and Michigan's sort of purple, right? I mean, Detroit is blue. You know, this little corner of it is kind of blue. And Detroit itself, you know, it has progressive policies, but the state doesn't. And it runs back and forth. The Midwestern states, you know, are Midwestern states. Y'all live here. You know, we never know what's going to happen with Midwestern states. But one of the things that happens, and you can see it in like the anti-affirmative action stuff, is that it's the amount of outside money that has come in, right? So California, blue state, with huge red pockets. A lot of people are like, oh, it's a huge Democratic crazy state. I'm like, no, this is a state that gave us Rockefeller and Ronald Reagan and Pete Wilson. You know, these are, so there's whole pockets of it. It's just at this point, the more Democrats outnumber, and because of the size of the Democrats have a tendency to congregate, blue and more progressive, more liberal, have a tendency to congregate in cities, and there's big enough cities in California to handle that. You know, but we're talking about particularly Prop 8, and also anti-affirmative action measure, which was Prop 209, and the anti-immigration measures, which is Prop 207, Prop 187. And the reason I remember this is because I was there at the time working on those issues, is that it was heavily funded by the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. Same in Hawaii, same in Alaska, the Stars. And so it was a lot of outside money. And an anti-affirmative action, Ward Connolly, took it to California, a lot of outside money, a lot of outside influences, and brought it to Michigan, and to other states. So there's a difference. There was a level of sort of containment, I think, in sort of very much sort of that construct of states' rights, right, that we're sort of returning to, but the influence of money and outside groups, and national groups, that, I mean, there were no sort of national groups as organized or sort of opposing anti-miscegenation. Many had just, struck them down on their own early. So, I mean, I think that's the explanation, is that there's more outside of any given state's influences. And it was mostly just saying that at this time those were still most resistant. Michigan, at a point where it's like, I think they're going to sort of, kind of not as much on, freaking out. No one in Michigan at this point is going, we don't have to listen to a federal judge. I mean, like, you don't have to do this just because a federal judge told you to, right? So, yeah.
Just going back to the issue of intersecting communities, well, for one thing, what we were just speaking about, probably a big difference is that there are a lot of religious leaders involved in the civil rights movement. There are a lot of religious leaders, even in the, pro-marriage equality when it came to miscegenation cases. And then today, of course, religious leaders are a lot of ones mobilizing against the marriage equality for LGBT community. And so you also have that issue with, the highest percentage of AIDS in the United States is among black gay men, I believe. And
Depends on the city.
right.
Well, also African American women of whatever sort of sexual orientation. So.
I have a friend who works in clinics in Pittsburgh and around there, it's really, really high rates. And so I'm wondering, when it comes to mobilizing the black community for gay rights and that kind of thing, like, there's religion is a big issue there. Like, how do you work with, how do you mobilize people who have that, when it comes to, it's an issue of health, it's an issue of people's lives, when there's that barrier, where religion kind of is in the way of the,
Yeah, it's to date, and I think it's a little bit of a misconception that the Black religious community is significantly more against same-sex marriage than white religious communities. And we all know that the most segregated day is Sunday, right? And because one of the things, you can look at the mobilization for marriage equality in DC, and it was Black progressive, Black left, Black religious leaders, Black clergy mobilizing for, and Black clergy mobilizing against, right? You know, DC, I think it has dropped to about 65% Black, but in the 67% Black. But that was a conversation being had among themselves, and so there is a bit of a sort of a trotting out, for lack of a better word, of the Black clergy, and we're totally targeted within California, voting against Prop 8. It was and utilized in a way that was sort of, which I argue and have argued in one of my papers, is very much against their self-interest. So there are and have been and always will be leadership among the Black clergy that have been fighting AIDS. There's a huge church in San Francisco that's taken in people with AIDS, and its congregants fed, housed, clothed since before we knew what AIDS HIV was, right? So it's one of the ways I argue in my paper is that it's Black people talking to Black people. It's like, white people need to talk to white people about racism, and Black people talking to Black people about homophobia or and heterosexism within their communities. And I mean, you'll see it's not Black clergy that are pouring money into major Black churches, are pouring lots of money into anti-marriage, right? I mean, this is the Mormon church, the Catholic church, and others, so, and not the ones who've been, it's not super, huge numbers of Black religious folks who are out, sort of marching against, like maybe vote against, but it's, it hasn't necessarily been that. So it's been, I mean, if you look at sort of the numbers and the way things have manifested itself, particularly in predominantly, and the same with Latinos, is that in talking amongst themselves, and, and the recognition also that, there's a little bit of a sort of quietness, because within Black communities, Black LGBT people have been there forever, and in the Black church have been there forever, and there's just sort of an issue not talking about it, which is, sort of okay. And you've watched the transition. The transition in the last 10 years has just been phenomenal, to the extent where it's like, we're not against it, So, and again, I think when it comes to certain particularized issues, whether they're individualized or grouped, that it takes those within talking about the issues to make changes. Right? So, I mean, it's not necessarily going to be Black folks constantly educating white folks about make an impact on racism. And I've had made the argument at the very least, right, not standing in the way, because there is no interest. Because talking, I guess it's the two-line piece, saying that there is no benefit to African American communities about restricting civil marriage as African American communities. There may be a benefit, which I don't know what it is, for religious communities, but not. There is nothing unique, right? Nothing dangerous to Blackness about equal marriage rights. Answer? We got 1, 2. Oh, sorry, Savala. Have you been holding your hand for a while?
Yeah,
Oh,
but
Savala. I'm like, oh yeah, there are people on that side of the room too. When I taught in this class, I made everybody sit over here because it is that.
I just want to bring it back to Michigan. So we're moving toward probably the federal level, Michigan will become a marriage equality state. But on the state level, they're passing legislation and laws trying to give businesses the right to discriminate, is the best way I can put it. What is the history of that? What are your thoughts on that? Are other states doing that? Was that common in the 60s? How likely is that to succeed or to lack?
Yes, other states are doing it and attempting to do it. Other states have done it. Other states have done levels of restrictions on other aspects of family life. When the Marriage Equality Amendment, the Anti-Marriage Equality Amendment passed in Michigan, those levels of conservatives were actually going to next work on dropping no-fault divorce, so making it harder, to get married and leave marriage. That's going to be an interesting one because we saw the restriction in Arizona was attempted, and this is a place, and both also in access and rights issues for LGBT individuals and couples, and same-sex couples, has actually been led by private business. And we saw that in Arizona, there was an attempt to sort of, the right to discriminate. And the NFL said, well, then guess we're not going to have our Super Bowl. Because there's sort of the power of the pocketbook. And some LGBT group, and let me rephrase that, at the upper echelons of the LGBT groups, when I say the upper echelons, so the A-list gays, we sort of refer to them, they're having access to the White House that has never been seen before, A. And B, an access to the boardrooms I've never been seen before. The head of Apple, I mean, in the sense of how many, and I think someone at some said that there may have been more openly gay Fortune 500 CEOs than there were women. Or not openly gay, I'm going to rephrase that. So there's not a doubt that Michigan and other states will potentially pass them, but they might be heavily lobbied into not. One of the things you see, sort of successful in Michigan is with the universities. It's a kind of the idea that not forbidden from sort of including domestic partners and the like on. From benefits, and then it becomes the menu aspect of it. But, still in many ways, as University of Michigan goes, so goes some of the other, we'll mess with municipalities, but not the universities. There have been people who are either going to leave, right? They're openly LGBT folks are like, fine, I can find another place to teach. So, it's going, and the coalitions that are being built around that are the economic interests, rebuilding a city, rebuilding a state, and to make it a place that is more tolerant, at the very least, not exclusive. We can't say you're going to be like loving everybody, but passing a law that allows for discrimination. Now, the next fight probably the next legal fight will be this conflict of anti-discrimination, which also includes anti-religious discrimination, and the idea that is somehow discriminating against or allowing people with First Amendment rights to practice their religion by allowing them to discriminate against LGBT folks or anyone else. Derek Bell actually wrote a circle parables pretty much. She was talking about the right to discriminate and the license to discriminate. It was an interesting thing, the idea that, sure, you could discriminate, you just had to have a license to do so. You put it out on your, your business and say, I will not serve, and then, but it costs a whole lot of money, to get this license. So, in some of the municipalities, you see that it's not really working. Seattle and the infamous, lesbian wedding cake. Well, we got 4 minutes. Well,
So putting aside sexual orientation, Black people have made, at least on paper, a lot of legal and moral strides, but implicit bias and white privilege are still, steep mountains to climb. And if you're talking about someone who is both Black and LGBT, can you talk a little bit about whether you see straight privilege and implicit bias around being LGBT as like equally difficult things to surmount in the context of sexual orientation?
I equally try not to, comparisons of oppressions just doesn't work, right? So I'm not going to say it's equally. They exist, and yes, they are things to surmount, and because there is sort of less on paper, and less in a commitment or faux or real, to overcome, unless, fewer sort of the implicit bias literature and the implicit bias work, which is wonderful. And we talked about it in my grandma class. Woohoo. Has primarily been on race and the ability to sort of identify. There are those things, it's like, many people think they can always tell who's gay or who's not, right? So there are those implicit biases. It's different manifestation because I think of the levels of hidden lives. But yes, I think that they both exist, and they manifest themselves within, those of us who are Black and LGBT, and many, in ways that are, as we talk about intersectional theory, undiscernible, right? Indiscernible. That if you're being, if you're Black lesbian being attacked, it's like, well, let's see, is it because I'm Black? Is it because I'm, gay? Is it because I'm, a woman? And that within the law, it's a little difficult also when you're talking about, anti-discrimination because of being held as sort of going, is this a race discrimination case, or is this a sexual orientation discrimination case, or is it a gender discrimination case? So the actual separation, I think, doesn't often in some ways identify, they're getting better at it, identify the intersectionality of people in places. So is it equal to, when something wrong is happening, it kind of doesn't matter, right? There's Judge, I forgot her name, in the Bay Area, who was talking about, well, you don't want to have gotten a job, your judgeship, just because you're Black. And she said, well, I'd rather get it before I'm Black than not get it because I'm Black, right? So when something's going wrong, you kind of don't, and it's that sense of, I'm not quite sure what's working here. And I don't think the law actually has a way to catch up with that yet. And at least there are some, and the law hasn't been able to catch up with that place of bias very well either. I mean, it's the overtness, right? And sometimes at this point, discrimination based on race are less overt. It can be subtler in many places, right? We sort of talk about the difference between the North and the South. And still, LGBT discrimination is more overt. And this concept that if it's not greatly overt, then we don't see it. I mean, you talk about sort of in the concept of the three college students in North Carolina who were murdered, Muslim college students who were in North Carolina who were murdered. The big fight was a hate crime, and or was it a murder over a parking space? And how many times do three people die over a parking space? But as others have said, the subtleties or the realism of what's happening with Muslims in North Carolina, it's that would they be dead over a parking space if they weren't? And that, sort of that level of bias. And so you sort of have to ask those questions about would that person be dead? Would the cops have reacted the way they did if they weren't? So, Samson?
I just have a question with regards to, I know marriage is very important, but it assumes that all LGBT individuals want to get married. If instead of, well, because they don't.
Yeah, they don't. That's why I'm agreeing with you.
If instead of looking at things through the biomedical lens, the LGBT community approached awareness more through a sociological perspective, instead of always focusing on you're either born with it or you're not, and how that comes into play with the law. So would it be better if instead
Okay, I think it's an interesting, because there's a piece that we're going to be talking about in June that's actually called Born This Way, and the impact of sexual fluidity on family law. And the idea that, the law can't figure out how to do with something without sort of having this constant, it's constructed this way of immutable characteristics. So it kind of have to have been, but it isn't the right question, right? It's about sort of, who one is and what one does. And so if, and within sort of LGBT communities, the notion of, it does separate, right? It's why it took, as forever as it did, to incorporate bisexual, transgender identified people, bi-identified people. You know, it was the gay movement, then it was the gay and lesbian movement, so we had to do with the L. So, what seemed to have really worked, which is different, I think, than in African American, Black civil rights, is the, everybody know, the idea that now you know, so coming out, right? Now you know someone is gay, right? So, which doesn't work because of geographical segregation. It's like many don't. I think there was a recent study that less than how many people, how many percentage of, it was a small percentage of white folk ever had any contact with Black people ever. Do you remember that study?
I do, I don't remember the statistics.
But it was pretty, it was huge.
Microscopic.
Yeah, it was microscopic, and I'm like, oh, how can that be, right? But it seems to have, worked that, sort of everybody, sort of at least 6 degrees of separation from someone gay. So that aspect, those sort of social aspects of it, and then properly targeting, as again, civil rights movement did, was finding the perfect plaintiffs. In the, Rosa Parks, for the Mark, Mildred and Richard Loving were like, could you have found anybody? Yeah, well, exactly, Virginia's for Lovers, and they, and they were both facing, being locked up for a year for leaving, the state, and to get married, they went to DC. So, those aspects of it, I think do have some similarities in that, and finding the perfect time, right? If we can't get, it's not gonna be ballots, it's gonna be the federal government. Somehow I found it odd that this was the perfect Supreme Court. I was like, really? Okay, people, do what you want. And I mean, you're exactly right when it comes to marriage. Not all LGBT, not all couples want to get married. There are serious marriage resistors, particularly of the sort of second wave feminists. Lesbian feminists are like, what? Marriage is an oppressive institution, Then, those of us get to a certain age and go I could end up in a hospital, and we need some Social Security benefits. I could get run over by a truck. So some of that stuff you can get does become important when you get a little older, whether you like it or not. Yeah, the practicality will take over. So a lot of, heterosexual folks who didn't get married until they decided to have kids, same with gay folks, right? That kind of reality of lives, too, I think has made a difference. That people were, openly living in with families. I mean, I'll answer your question at all. I'm just starting to
Yeah.
I think that's it, gang. Thank you all for coming and staying.